The imperial palace in Addis Ababa was more than a residence. It was a self-contained universe, hermetically sealed from the city that sprawled at its feet. A world of gilded halls, manicured gardens, and profound, echoing silence. Within these walls, the Ethiopia of the common man, a land of rugged mountains, ancient traditions, and burgeoning struggles, seemed a distant rumor. Here, time did not tick by in minutes and hours as measured by ordinary clocks. It flowed, ebbed, and stood still according to the will and the routine of a single individual. The day began before dawn, with prayers, followed by a relentless schedule of audiences, state papers, and meticulous oversight of the vast machinery of government. Ministers, ambassadors, and petitioners would wait for hours, sometimes days, for a brief audience. The nation's business moved at the emperor's pace, and his pace alone. It followed the rhythm of one man, His Majesty the Emperor Haile Selassie I. His full title was a litany of divine right and ancient power. His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, and elect of God. These were not mere honorifics. They were the bedrock of his legitimacy, tracing his lineage back 3,000 years to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. According to the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's sacred national epic, the dynasty was founded by their son, Menelik I, who brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. To challenge the emperor was to challenge this sacred history, to question the very will of God. He was the conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. He was the elect of God. He was the King of Kings of Ethiopia. Life in his court was a constant, unblinking performance of power. His every move was a ceremony. His every word was a decree. Ministers would prostrate themselves, touching their foreheads to the floor before speaking, never turning their back on him as they retreated. The air was thick with a protocol so heavy, so intricate, that a misplaced glance or an ill-chosen word could mean ruin. It was a universe of whispered conversations and guarded expressions, where the atmosphere itself seemed to bend to the gravity of his presence. Physically, he was a small man, slight of build and not imposing in stature, but this fact was utterly irrelevant in his presence. His authority was absolute, and it emanated from a source deeper than physical size. It was concentrated in his gaze. His eyes were deep, penetrating, and seemed to miss nothing. They were the focal point of his power, the instruments through which he projected an aura of near omniscience. It was in his eyes. Courtiers would say he could read your thoughts, that he knew of treachery before it was even fully formed in the traitor's mind. Stories circulated of officials who, after a single silent glance from the emperor, would find themselves demoted or posted to a remote province, their secret ambitions seemingly laid bare. This perception was a powerful tool of control. It fostered a climate that went beyond mere respect. It was a profound, almost primal fear, mingled with a deep and abiding awe for a figure who seemed more than mortal. He was more than a ruler. He was the living symbol of the nation itself. His portrait hung in every government office, every shop, every humble home. For many Ethiopians he was not simply the head of state. He, Ethiopia, the embodiment of its ancient history and its modern aspirations. This symbolism extended far beyond his borders. In Jamaica, the nascent Rastafari movement saw in his coronation the fulfillment of a prophecy. Hailing him as a living god, the Black Messiah returned to earth. He was a global icon, a canvas onto which people projected their hopes for black liberation and dignity. Born Tafari Makanan, he had been a modernizing force even before his coronation, as regent to Empress Zuditu. As emperor, he accelerated this mission. He introduced Ethiopia's first written constitution in 1931. He built schools and hospitals, established the national airline, and sent the brightest of Ethiopia's youth to be educated in Europe and America. He understood that to preserve Ethiopia's independence in a predatory world, it had to modernize. But this was modernization from the top down, a gift bestowed by the emperor, not a right demanded by the people. Progress was a tool to strengthen the state and the throne, not to foster democracy. His international stature reached its zenith in 1936. After Mussolini's fascist Italy invaded his homeland, Haile Selassie stood before the League of Nations in Geneva and delivered one of the most powerful speeches of the 20th century. He warned the world that its failure to act against aggression in Ethiopia would lead to its own doom. "It is us today," he prophesied. "It will be you tomorrow." His words were ignored, but they transformed him into a global icon of anti-fascism and a martyr for the cause of collective security. Decades later, he would be instrumental in founding the Organization of African Unity, with its headquarters in his own capital, cementing his role as a patriarch of African independence. Yet, the hero of the world stage was an absolute monarch at home. The modernizer was also a stubborn autocrat, a ruler who believed his wisdom was supreme and his authority unchallengeable. He clung to the levers of absolute power with an iron grip. Political parties were banned, the press was a mouthpiece for the state, and any hint of dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. The very students he had sent abroad for education returned with ideas of democracy and popular sovereignty that he could not and would not tolerate. But every sun must set, and the gilded world he had so carefully constructed over 5 decades began to show deep, irreparable cracks. The emperor, now an old man, seemed increasingly detached from the realities of his country. While the court continued its elaborate rituals, a devastating famine swept through the Volo province in the early 1970s, killing hundreds of thousands. The state-controlled media ignored the crisis, and the stark contrast between the silent suffering of the people and the continued opulence of the palace became a fatal wound to the regime's legitimacy. The whispers in the corridors grew into angry shouts in the streets. The story of Haile Selassie is therefore not just the story of a great king or a complex man. It is the story of a great tragic fall. It is the story of how a figure who embodied a 3,000-year-old dynasty, who brought his ancient kingdom into the modern age and became a symbol of hope for millions around the world, could be brought down by the very forces he had unleashed and by his inability to let go of the past. His fall was not just personal, it was the end of an epic, the final, violent collapse of an imperial world that had outlived its time. He was not born to be emperor. He was born Liege Tafari Makonnen on July 23, 1892, a prince of a dynasty that claimed an epic lineage, stretching back 3,000 years to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This was the Solomonic line, the sacred thread of Ethiopian identity. His father was Ras Makonnen, a brilliant general, governor of the strategic province of Harar, and a trusted cousin of the reigning emperor, Menelik II. Tafari was born into the highest echelons of the nobility, at a time when Ethiopia was asserting its sovereignty against encroaching European powers. Just 4 years after his birth, his father would play a crucial role at the Battle of Adwa, where Ethiopia decisively defeated an invading Italian army, securing its place as the only African nation to successfully repel a colonial conquest. This victory echoed through Tafari's childhood, a constant reminder of his nation's unique destiny and the heavy burden of leadership he might one day inherit. He was a child of a proud ancient kingdom, grappling with the dawn of a new, uncertain century. His education was a deliberate bridge between two worlds. Under the guidance of his father, Tafari received a rigorous traditional schooling from Ethiopian priests like Abba Samuel. He mastered Amharic and the liturgical language of Ge'ez, immersing himself in the scriptures and the glorious history of his nation. But his father, a man who had traveled to Europe and understood the shifting global landscape, knew this was not enough. He also hired a French Capuchin missionary, Dr. Vitalien, to tutor his son. From him, Tafari learned fluent French, the language of international diplomacy, and was introduced to European history, modern science, and global politics. This dual education was his father's greatest gift. It forged a mind that was both deeply Ethiopian and uniquely cosmopolitan, capable of quoting ancient texts while understanding the mechanics of a modern state. It gave him a perspective that few in the empire possessed, allowing him to see his country's future not as a rejection of its past, but as a careful synthesis of tradition and progress. In 1906, tragedy struck. His father, Ras Makonnen, died suddenly. At just 13, Tafari was an orphan. He was summoned from the relative safety of Harar to the imperial court in the new capital, Addis Ababa. Emperor Menelik, now aging and without a clear male heir, took the promising boy under his wing. But the court was a treacherous place, a nest of vipers where powerful nobles, generals, and ministers constantly jockeyed for influence around the ailing emperor. Here, surrounded by intrigue and suspicion, the young Tafari learned the essential, unspoken rules of power. He learned to be patient, to listen more than he spoke, to mask his thoughts behind an impassive expression, and to build alliances with quiet discretion. It was a brutal but necessary apprenticeship. In this crucible of ambition and betrayal, he mastered the art of survival, honing the political instincts that would define his long and complex career. He understood that in the Game of Thrones, one misstep could mean oblivion. In 1910, at the age of just 18, Tafari was appointed governor of his late father's province, Harar. This was his chance to escape the court's suffocating atmosphere and build his own independent power base. He governed Harar as a laboratory for his ideas. He reformed the tax system to make it more equitable and efficient, curbing the power of corrupt local chiefs. He established the first modern schools and hospitals in the region. He invested in infrastructure, understanding that roads and communication were the arteries of a modern state. Crucially, he began to build a small, well-trained and salaried local army, loyal directly to him, not to the feudal lords or the central government. He was testing the very ideas of modernization he would later apply to the entire nation, proving his competence not through rhetoric, but through results. Harar became his fortress, his source of revenue, and the foundation of his political strength. Back in Addis Ababa, the empire was teetering on the brink of chaos. Menelik II had died in 1913, and his designated heir and grandson, Iyasu V, proved to be a disaster. The young emperor was erratic, impulsive, and openly flouted the court's conservative traditions. Most alarmingly, he began to show strong sympathies towards Islam, alienating the two pillars of the Ethiopian state, the powerful Christian nobility and the ancient Ethiopian Orthodox Church. For the ruling elite, this was an existential threat. In September 1916, a powerful coalition of Shawan aristocrats and church leaders acted. They declared Iyasu deposed. In his place, they named Menelik's daughter Zuditu as empress, the first woman to rule the Ethiopian empire in her own right since the Queen of Sheba. Zuditu was deeply pious, conservative, and a symbol of continuity with the past. But the nobles knew she could not govern alone. They needed a man to run the country, someone with modern sensibilities who could engage with the outside world. They chose the 24-year-old governor of Harar. They saw him as intelligent and capable, but also young, and they believed controllable. It was a profound miscalculation. They elevated him, granting him the title of Rastafari, making him regent and official heir to the throne. All executive power was vested in his hands. The stage was now set for one of the most fascinating political dramas of the 20th century. For the next 14 years, the imperial court was a silent battlefield. It was a government divided against itself. The Empress Zuditu, supported by the Old Guard and the powerful Minister of War, Fitarari Habte Georgis, represented traditional, isolationist Ethiopia. She and her faction viewed Tafari's reforms with deep suspicion, seeing them as a threat to their faith and their feudal privileges. On the other side was Rastafari, the champion of the modernizing future. He methodically built a party of young, foreign-educated Ethiopians who believed that the nation's survival depended on change. Every policy decision, from abolishing feudal tribute to building secular schools, became a bitter struggle, a test of wills between the two camps. Tafari played the long game masterfully. While the conservatives focused on internal power, he looked outward. His single greatest maneuver was bringing Ethiopia into the League of Nations in 1923. This was a diplomatic masterstroke. It placed Ethiopia firmly on the world map, granting it international recognition and a collective security guarantee against the colonial ambitions of its neighbors. Internally, it was just as significant. It bolstered his own prestige immeasurably. He was now Ethiopia's face to the world, the man who had secured its seat among the sovereign nations. Any move against him could now be portrayed as a move against Ethiopia's international standing, a risk the old guard was hesitant to take. The simmering conflict finally boiled over in 1930. The Empress's own husband, Ras Gugsa Well, a powerful northern lord, raised a massive army and marched on the capital, determined to crush Tafari and end his reforms. This was the final, decisive battle between the old Ethiopia and the new. At the Battle of Ankem, Ras Gugsa's vast but traditional feudal army was met by the small, modern force loyal to Tafari. The outcome was a stunning demonstration of the power of technology. Tafari's army, better armed and more disciplined, was supported by a single airplane used for reconnaissance, a terrifying sight for the opposing soldiers. Ras Gugsa was killed, and his army was scattered. The rebellion was crushed. The victory was absolute. With the conservative faction broken, a humiliated Empress Zuditu was forced to crown him Negus, or king. All real power was now in his hands. Just 2 days after the battle, Empress Zuditu died. The official cause was illness, but the timing has fueled speculation for decades. With her death, the last obstacle to supreme power was gone. The throne was his. On November 2, 1930, in a ceremony of ancient splendor and modern pomp attended by dignitaries from across the globe, Negus Tafari was crowned. He took a new name, a throne name that would echo through history, Haile Selassie I, meaning power of the Trinity. He was now the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, King of kings, elect of God, Emperor of Ethiopia. The long, patient, and perilous climb was over. The orphan from Harar now held the destiny of an ancient empire in his hands. But a shadow stretched from the north. Mussolini's Italy, hungry for a new Roman Empire, eyed Ethiopia greedily. The emperor knew his army was no match. His frantic modernization was a race against time, a race he was losing. In October 1935, the invasion began. The Italians dropped poison gas on soldiers and civilians alike. The emperor appealed to the League of Nations. They condemned the invasion, but their weak sanctions did nothing. Facing total defeat, the emperor made a terrible choice: to flee and continue the fight from abroad.
He stood before the world and gave a prophetic warning. "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." The world listened, felt pity, and then did nothing.
For 5 years, he was a king without a kingdom. But he never stopped working, refusing to let the world forget Ethiopia. When World War II began, the tide turned. The British, now at war with Italy, backed his return. On May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years after his capital fell, the emperor returned in triumph. The conquering lion had returned to his throne. After the war, he was an international figure, an elder statesman with immense moral authority. He shifted his focus to Africa, positioning Addis Ababa as the capital of the continent. His greatest achievement came in 1963. He united the continent's radical and conservative factions to found the Organization of African Unity, cementing his status as the Father of Africa. But far away, in the ghettos of Jamaica, his image took on a different meaning. For the new Rastafari movement, he was not just an emperor, he was God incarnate. Seeing his coronation as a prophecy, they took his name, Rastafari. His speech at the UN was adapted into the song War, turning him into a global icon of resistance. Though a devout Christian, the emperor gave a plot of his personal land in Shashamane to Rastafari, who wished to return to Africa, embracing his role as a symbol of hope. While Haile Selassie played the statesman on the world stage, back home, the very foundations of his empire were beginning to crack. The modernization he had championed was a double-edged sword. The students he had sent abroad for the finest education the West could offer were returning, but they didn't just bring back degrees in engineering and medicine. They brought back ideas. Dangerous ideas. They had seen parliamentary democracy, read Marx and Lenin, and debated the merits of revolution in the cafes of Paris and London. They returned to Ethiopia and saw not a divinely ordained kingdom, but a feudal society rife with inequality, a nation frozen in time. The ground was shifting. This new generation, his creation, was becoming his greatest threat. The first true shock to the system came in December of 1960. While the emperor was on a state visit to Brazil, his own elite imperial bodyguard, the very men sworn to die for him, launched a coup. Led by the brothers Mengistu and Germain Niue, they seized control of the capital and declared the emperor deposed. For a few tense days it seemed the ancient monarchy had fallen. But the plotters had miscalculated. The regular army and the air force remained loyal, and the powerful Orthodox Church condemned the rebellion. Selassie rushed back, and the coup was brutally crushed. But the illusion of universal, unquestioning loyalty was shattered forever. The emperor had seen the face of betrayal, and it wore a familiar uniform. The event left a deep scar on his psyche, fostering a suspicion that would curdle into paranoia in the years to come. Then, a decade later, a different kind of catastrophe unfolded, one not of bullets and politics, but of silence and starvation. In the northern province of Wollo, the life-giving seasonal rains failed, and then they failed again. A great famine, a biblical horror began to creep across the land. It started slowly, a quiet crisis in a remote region. Farmers watched their crops turn to dust. Livestock, the currency of rural life, collapsed and died. The government's response was tragically inadequate. The feudal structure of the empire, which relied on a chain of loyalty, proved incapable of handling a humanitarian disaster. Local governors, terrified of reporting failure to the emperor, minimized the scale of the crisis. The official policy was denial. To admit to a famine of this magnitude would be to admit that the emperor, the father of the nation, was unable to provide for his people. The government did everything it could to hide the truth, especially from the outside world. In 1973, Addis Ababa was celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Organization of African Unity, the emperor's proudest achievement. As foreign dignitaries toasted with French champagne in the capital's grand halls, hundreds of thousands of his subjects were starving to death just a few hundred kilometers to the north. The contrast was grotesque, a moral catastrophe, but the truth could not be contained. A young British journalist, Jonathan Dimbleby, smuggled a film crew into Wollo and captured the apocalypse. His documentary, broadcast in the UK and around the world, was titled The Unknown Famine. The images were unforgettable, searing the conscience of the West, and they destroyed Haile Selassie's carefully cultivated international image as a wise, benevolent patriarch. The man who had stood up to Mussolini was now seen as a callous monarch, feasting while his people died. His greatest shield, his global reputation, was gone. The famine was the spark that lit the revolutionary fire. The revelation of the government's cover-up unleashed a wave of fury across the nation. The crisis of the state was no longer just ideological, it was existential. A series of strikes, triggered by a spike in fuel prices, paralyzed the country. Taxi drivers, teachers, students, and then, crucially, the military. Soldiers in the South mutinied over low pay and poor conditions. The unrest spread like a contagion, a spontaneous eruption of every grievance that had been suppressed for decades. Watching from the shadows was a coordinating committee of low-ranking army and police officers. They were anonymous, a collection of majors and captains who were tired of the corrupt aristocratic generals. They called themselves the Derg, an ancient Ge'ez word for committee. They were nationalists, populists, and increasingly, Marxists. They saw their chance in the chaos. They didn't launch a frontal assault. Instead, they began a creeping coup, a slow, methodical strangulation of imperial power that unfolded over several months. It was a work of political genius. They used the emperor's own authority against him. They established a commission of inquiry and, using the popular slogan Ethiopia Tictum, or Ethiopia First, they began arresting the emperor's most powerful ministers and closest confidants, all in his name, to root out corruption and punish those responsible for the famine. Each arrest was announced on public radio, chipping away at the regime's authority, isolating the emperor piece by piece. The old guard was confused, divided, and unable to mount a defense. They were being dismantled by a faceless committee acting with the emperor's apparent blessing. The emperor, now 82 years old, became a prisoner in his own Jubilee Palace. He was a ghost haunting the halls of his own government, forced to watch as the world he had meticulously built over 50 years was systematically destroyed. His most trusted advisors vanished into prisons. The state media that once deified him now broadcast propaganda against his class. He was utterly alone, a relic of a bygone age, surrounded by soldiers whose true allegiance was to the shadowy Derg. The final day came on September 12, 1974, the day after the Ethiopian New Year. After months of preparation, of propaganda, of slowly stripping him of all power and dignity, the Derg was ready to end the charade. The instrument of this historic moment was not a column of tanks but a single, sputtering Volkswagen Beetle. A small group of junior officers entered the palace and were shown into his presence. They read him a proclamation, a list of charges accusing him of presiding over the decay and destruction of the nation. They declared His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, deposed. He listened patiently, a lifetime of absolute power reduced to this final, quiet moment of surrender. When they finished, he replied with regal dignity, stating that if the revolution was for the good of the Ethiopian people, then he would not stand in its way. He accepted his fate as the will of God. In a final, calculated act of humiliation, the man who had commanded armies and addressed world leaders was placed in the back of the tiny car and driven away. As the Beetle passed through the streets, the reaction was mixed. Some cheered the downfall of a tyrant. Others, who had known him only as a semi-divine figure, watched in silent, profound shock. It was more than the end of a man or a reign. It was the end of an epic. The 3,000-year-old Solomonic dynasty, the central pillar of Ethiopia's identity, had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a car door. He was held in a small room in the palace basement. His captors wanted him to break, but he gave them only his silent dignity. State radio announcer, VO. The emperor has died of complications from surgery. Narrator, VO. On August 27, 1975, the state radio announced he had died of complications from surgery. Almost no one believed it. The rumors said he was murdered. For 17 years, the truth stayed buried. After the Derg fell, investigators found his skeleton beneath his successor's office toilet, an ultimate act of desecration. In 2000, 25 years after his death, Haile Selassie was finally given an imperial funeral. In Ethiopia, his legacy is a battlefield. For some, he is the father of the modern nation. For others, his name is a curse. He was a man of immense contradictions, a reformer who became a prisoner of his own absolute power. The emperor is dead, his empire is gone. He was the sun, and when he was eclipsed, the entire system fell into darkness. But the myth endures. The Lion of Judah may be silent, but his roar is still heard.